If you ever have a power play that's struggling, just call 1-800 Seattle Kraken. It'll cure what ails you every time.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to today's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and now the #1 sports podcast network. Thanks for joining us. I am your host, Harrison Lee, and I'm a Jets fan. Obviously, last night we had Winnipeg versus Seattle, very pivotal game, and the Jets just greased the Kraken. I know the first period was pretty bad, but after the Jets started getting some power plays, couple of which were a little questionable, but overall probably pretty earned. The Jets just kind of took over, and Seattle kind of showed us why they're still not a playoff team. They look bad. I know the Jets have struggled this year, but there are definitely teams that are quite far below them in playing quality, and Seattle, by a pretty good margin, is one of them. Want to dive into that as well as some really big standout performances from the kids and why I hope this is one of the biggest lessons the Jets take from this year. And speaking of the kids, who might make the Jets next year, and what are we going to look at in terms of a roster as we start approaching the next season? First, though, Jets versus Kraken, big 6-2 victory. Obviously, the Jets are kind of in that purgatory of sort of on the cusp of a playoff spot, but not quite. That said, if they want any hope of making the postseason, they have to earn every single point between now and the end of the season. They got through the hardest part of their schedule that was remaining with Dallas and Colorado, and those teams knocked off. Thursday's game against the Blues might be, one of the biggest of the season. This is a game that controls a lot of different things for quite a few teams. The Blues obviously are in the same position of kind of tanking softly, also kind of trying to make the playoffs. So the Jets are right there with them. You've got a bunch of teams that are sort of in this territory. And in terms of the overall league standings, you've also got other teams that have already been eliminated, but they're on the eastern side, right? Had they been in the West, they'd still be in a playoff race, but they're kind of around where the Jets are. So how they perform and what games they do or don't win also does really impact the Jets standings here. This game against the Kraken was a little interesting, though, because at first it didn't really start out super strong. Winnipeg had a very bad first period where guys were missing assignments. There were communication issues because Seattle would use a lot of east-west lateral movement after kind of circling below the goal line, which then led to a lot of man zone de-assignment losses and breakages. We saw some really bad miscommunication and stuff. The Kraken did get one early off of one of those shifts, Eberle potting a backhand where a bunch of dudes were getting beat below the goal line, and then there was a whole goal mouth chaotic scramble of a sort. Just seemed like the team was out of position, not really sure of what was going on. And, Brad Lambert, I think, sort of had an emblematic shift of this where he was under pressure and skated into Jacob Bryson trying to escape that attacking forechecker who was on his back, and then it led to a turnover. So, remember Brad Lambert's name. He had an very interesting game, and he's one of the guys that I want to talk about with respect to playing the kids. But overall, right, Winnipeg came into this game having a bit of a power play nightmare. The PP, especially the top unit, has really been ineffective. 1 in 5 men needs a little bit of assistance, and the Jets' power play was no different. Unfortunately for the Jets, there's no medicinal treatment for getting your power play back into good shape and working order. Not so simple, right? You have to have some good tactical adjustments and stuff. And the Jets decided that their move was to swap Perfetti and Taves, which on paper is kind of funny. The main thing I think the Jets were hoping for was that Taves would win the faceoffs so they wouldn't have to worry about the zone transitions, because the Jets on power play entries are not good when they don't have Ehlers. And that has been pretty noticeable. It's one of the reasons the Jets' power play has really stagnated. They just don't get inside the offensive zone as easily as they used to. Taves actually ended up scoring the first goal of the night for Winnipeg. There was a weird carom off the backboards. He was right there net front. The Kraken have the 31st ranked PK unit, Not exactly hard to see why. They lost pretty much every single battle. They looked embarrassingly out of sorts. They did a lot of puck watching. I don't know how they have an NHL caliber coaching staff here, given what I saw from this team. They were just poor. I mean, it was poorly coached, poorly managed, and the players just didn't really seem to know what to do. And so the Jets' power play, which had been very quiet recently, yes, they did benefit from a number of deflections and tips and stuff that got them 3 PP goals, but I think it was pretty earned. I mean, the Jets just very much outclassed this PK unit that the Kraken put together. I mean, Seattle looked like they had no idea what was going on every time they took a penalty. So after a rough first period, once those power plays started rolling in, the tide of the game very much turned, and the Jets had a very quick lead before the Kraken could even really respond. As the game started to wear on, I think a lot of the Jets started putting 2 and 2 together. You saw more confident shifts. The Kraken did have a couple of decent looks, don't get me wrong, and I think Hellebuck had to make a couple of pretty solid saves. But for the most part, like, the Jets were definitely the better team. And that definitely showed in the second half of the game as Seattle started running out of ideas for how to claw back in this one. The Kraken did score 1 goal later, but it wasn't really anything to worry about. By that point, the Jets already had a pretty solid lead. And yeah, it did get the Kraken within striking distance. But again, as the Jets, continued to control play late, it didn't end up factoring in too much to the final scoreline. Lambert got himself a goal after Isak Rosén kind of set the table with a great energy shift earlier. Again, I want to focus a little more on those moments because I think there's some interesting tales to tell from that. But the Lambert goal, if you haven't seen it, I am going to use the first not safe for work tag I've ever used on the YouTube channel here. It was pornographically good hockey. There was this shift where Lambert started deep in the DZ, comes up on a rush, and I think Nemesnikov was in the neutral zone and sort of saw or knew Lambert was coming up the wing. So he just sort of dropped the puck off and sort of left it, didn't really mess with it too much. Lambert grabs it, and Niederreiter kind of drifts into the center slot. You've got Nemesnikov or Lowry, I forget who it was, a little further left, and it set up a 3-on-2. Now, most players are looking past the whole way, and Lambert was doing the same thing. Obviously, he had his head turned. He was looking off the pass the whole time, and right as Dunn started coming over, he bit really hard on the fake because he has to. It's an odd man situation. Lambert immediately, as soon as he saw Dunn hesitate just slightly, snapped his head, had that little bit of a shift in his edge work to where he could sort of pivot and sort of just take off and get separation, and then blasted home one of the best goals of the season for this team, especially from like an individual effort. I know it's not one of the flashiest goals in a lot of ways because it wasn't like tic-tac-toe play, one of those filthy Velarde goals. But I think if you think about the way the player, in particular Lambert here, is processing the game and doing it at speed, this goal is just, it's sexy. It's hot. It is the exact kind of goal that this team needs to see from players that are not on the top line. Winnipeg doesn't have a lot of goal-scoring punch down the lineup. We know that. It's been one of the biggest problems this year. So seeing a guy like Lambert do this kind of goal and score the sort of marker with the way that he did it and sort of the situation that he did it in, along with just his forechecking and defensive efforts that I thought really stood out tonight, I was biting my lip for a lot of the latter portion of this game, which not something I've said a lot about with respect to the Jets this year. Because of that, I want to focus on the kids. Rosén also had an evening that I would say was really worth shouting out, and I hope that the Jets next year really take this lesson to heart, that it is time to start freaking playing the kids. Want to chat about why? Coming right up. We are now into the final stages of college basketball, and of course, we've also got the NBA playoffs. Every possession matters, every matchup is always magnified, and every game can swing a series, so this is your time to get in on the action. FanDuel is giving new customers a great way to get in, as all of these games and playoffs are winding up and down depending on which sport you're after. What you can do is bet just $5 and get $250 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. It ensures you keep the winnings going all tournament long. The app makes it easy to follow along with great player stats, live feeds, and trends throughout all of your favorite games and teams. And during the playoffs, that extra insight really matters when you're trying to find that edge and figure out who is going to lead your team to victory. So this is your chance to get in on the action. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. FanDuel, play your game, celebrate the playoffs the right way. Workplace chaos, deadlines stacking up, inbox overflowing, and the one position you have to fill is still sitting open. When the pressure's on and you need the right hire, this is a job for Indeed sponsored jobs. It helps you reach the people who actually fit what you're looking for. From skills, experience, and location, no matter what it is, they're helping you find the right candidates faster, so you're not just hoping somebody stumbles across your post. Here's a stat that truly says it all, too. In the minute that I've been talking to you, companies like yours made 27 hires on Indeed, and that is based on their worldwide data. If you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed-sponsored jobs. We have a very special offer for those of you who are listening. You'll get a $75 sponsored job credit to help get your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnWinnipegJets. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnWinnipegJets right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. That's Indeed.com/LockedOnWinnipegJets. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed sponsored jobs. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I just realized I probably omitted one of the most important facts from tonight's Jets game. Feels a little bit trite to say this, especially in light of how big of an accomplishment it is. But, with all of those chaotic bounces and things, guess who got himself point number 900 in his career? Mark Scheifele. He is now second in team history behind Dale. Obviously, Dale has, I think, around 929 or so. And so Scheifele is like on the doorstep of a huge monumental career achievement. In fact, he also got .901 as well tonight. So very, very, very big moment for him. And I think, seeing him develop and where he's come since, the start of his career is fascinating, right? He was a 7th overall pick, not too far from where Cole Perfetti was picked, by the way. Obviously, Scheifele has had, a career that's probably going to be a lot longer and perhaps a lot more successful than Perfetti may be able to reach. But really, really incredible accomplishment. Very few players stick around long enough to get close to 1,000 points, let alone 1,000 NHL games. You think about all the things that led to Scheifele getting to this point, and it is a really, really big achievement and something that is worth celebrating. I was a little excited about the kids in some ways, and I felt like I neglected to talk about perhaps one of the biggest moments of the night. But yeah, Scheifele, man, he is getting closer to that millennium mark. What a crazy achievement. He's so close. And amidst all that, right, seeing his development and how he's progressed over the years, it's why I've, always been talking about the Jets as a draft and develop team. I think that is something that I keep coming back to. And obviously, you notice I've talked about this being the part where I want to say it's time to play the kids. This is a really important thing that I think the Jets for several years have kind of gotten away from. Playing the youth is something that in a lot of ways invites risk to a lineup, and the Jets are risk averse. Obviously, they've had to be in some ways because, again, they operate in a different market than a lot of other teams. And so the talent that they've accrued, they're intending to keep it long term. They don't want it to go anywhere. They understand that it's harder to recruit through free agency and trades. And so, they're not liable to take as many risks. They want the playoff appearances. They want those playoff runs. They have struggled to make that happen, though. And I think the disconnect for this team has been that they've got a pretty great regular season core over the years that's won a lot of games. They've won a banner, a President's Trophy. They had a much better playoff performance last season, relatively speaking. They've been a cup favorite as recently as about 7 or 8 years ago, which is not that long in some ways. But I think in the NHL, obviously time moves a little faster in this league. And so that is in NHL terms quite long ago. And I think where Winnipeg has struggled to sort of connect the dots is if you want to raise your ceiling, you're going to have to use those kids you're drafting and that supposedly you believe in to start boosting those depth positions up above just your average third and fourth liners. Lambert and Roseanne, I think, showed in this game against the Kraken why it's so important to give the kids room to breathe, the confidence to thrive, and the skill to work with. Lambert actually performed pretty well despite working more with forechecking guys like Nemesnikov and Niederreiter. He still managed to get himself a great goal, in part set up by the rush that those two helped encourage. But Roseanne, I think, may have even had the best player performance of the night amongst the kids. He was making some really sharp defensive reads. I think one of the best was an interception in the neutral zone that the Kraken were about to feed off of a counter. Might have actually had an odd man rush for a goal against, but Roseanne sniffed it out very quickly and ended up actually creating an offensive opportunity for the Jets. Probably could have had a point or two in this game. He had a couple of really smart shots, a couple of great passes. He came really, really close to scoring a goal. And so, yeah, this is the kind of stuff that I think the Jets really should be taking to heart. Yes, in previous years, I understand why you wanted to be veteran heavy, and I think there was a pretty fair argument for it. Lambert, earlier in his career, was a bit of a wild card. Really hard to get a read on him. Not always the safest with the puck in some of his decisions. Obviously, that is something that he's wanted to iron out. He also didn't always follow through on his forechecks, wasn't as physical, yada, 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 you name it. There was a list of things that people complained about. Look at him since coming back up now, though. He finishes his checks along the wall. He set up some great passes. He still has games where he'll have some rough shifts and turnovers. We saw a couple of them against the Kraken. But the more that he is allowed to sort of experiment and figure out what works within the structures that he's allowed to, I think you're going to see that confidence and that skill really start to glow and prosper. And that's what the Jets desperately need. They don't have a lot to work with elsewhere. They can't bring in a lot of talent externally. The Jets have to be a true draft and develop team. Look at the successes that they're having with guys like Sandberg and now Salamonson. Translate that to the forward group as well. Start calling up some of these kids. See if they really can't play a true role for you heading into the next couple of seasons. Scheifele is 33. Hellebuck is around the same age. Morrissey's getting up there in years. Lowry and Connor not too far off. Lowry's 32 or so. Connor is getting closer to 30. These guys are starting to move towards the senior years of their careers, and that means typically that there's a bit of a drop off. Connor and Scheifele are both about to post nearly career seasons for themselves. Scheifele is 3 away from 100, which I actually predicted he'd have this year. I thought he was going to hit 100 points. I don't know why, but I just thought he was cooking, and I felt like this was going to be the season that he did it. Looks like he's truly going to do it. He just needs 3 points in about 5 games. So, what a year it's been for him. But they can't do it themselves, right? They need support. They need further depth in the lineup. And the Jets have kind of been plugging those gaps with a lot of guys that didn't move the needle. Nyquist, Taves, those players were doing about the best that they could. And in some ways, Nyquist tilted the ice. Taves has been able to add some scoring touch here and there on a couple of shifts. But generally speaking, not the kind of games and performances that move the needle overall. And so if you want to raise your ceiling, you've got to add skill up and down the lineup. And I think seeing these kids really thrive in these NHL roles they've been allowed to have, mostly through injury, is hopefully the wake-up call the Jets need to get themselves back on the track. I do still think this team has stuff to work with, and I'm a little bit more bullish on some of the prospects than I think the broader media and perhaps some fans are. I think there are real projectable tools, and I think the way that they've been drafting the last few years is going to lead to a crop of pro players that's fairly sizable. Now, they're not going to all be elite, and I think we should very much caution that, but I think a couple of these guys are really going to be very solid Jets and can fill in some of these depth roles as some of the veterans start cycling out. Is it going to be a hidden second-line center or something in this pool? Probably not. But the Jets still need to figure out what they do have, and the only way that you can really do that is putting them in a position to succeed and giving them some real NHL time. Look at what Brad Lambert has done since being told he was up with the team. He's been like a totally different player. He's not looking over his shoulder all the time. He's not worried about the fact that he's only going to get 5 or 10 games before he's back to the Moose. He's had a real chance to thrive, and I think that's really made a difference in both his approach, his body language, and the performance that we're seeing on the ice. He looks like a totally brand new guy, and I think that is a sure sign that the Jets need to take to heart. You give the kids room to grow and room to succeed, they will reward you in kind. There is risk. It may not work every time, but I think the Jets deserve to reap the rewards of some of the great draft selections they've made over the past several years. Amidst that conversation, though, you might be asking who exactly is going to be on this team next year, because we have a lot of expiring contracts and not a lot of insight and clarity as to where the Jets see this team going. I want to talk about that in more detail coming right up. Spring is a natural reset point, and if there's one thing that can quietly cost businesses money, it's messy communication. Missed calls, scattered texts, no clear thread of who said what. That's why today's episode is brought to you by Quo, spelled Quo, the smarter way to run your business communications. Quo is the #1 rated business phone system on G2 with over 3,000 reviews, trusted by more than 90,000 businesses. It lets your entire team share one business number so you never miss a call, text, or opportunity. And everything lives in one clean thread, so there's always calls, texts, and voicemails for your team to access in one contiguous thread. They can always see everything at all times. You don't miss customers, you don't miss calls. It's fantastic. And their AI summaries save serious time by logging those calls and summarizing some of the most important takeaways and action items for your team to get on. Make this season make this the season that no opportunity and no customer ever slips away. Try Quo free and get 20% off your first 6 months at quo.com/lockedonnhl. That's quo.com/lockedonnhl. Quo, no missed calls, no missed customers. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am just wanting to wrap up with some thoughts on, the Jets next season, right? There's a lot riding on the future of this team. They have got a fair few players under contract. They've also got a fair few expiring in about 2 to 3 seasons. And that leaves the Jets with some bigger questions as to, what next year's team looks like, how they're going to approach what happened this year. Will they learn the right lessons? Yada, yada, yada. I've talked about that a lot. So I want to focus on who I think makes this team. Now, obviously, all the guys with term, I think, are likely to come back. I do have a question a little bit about Dylan DeMello. DeMello, I do wonder if the Jets start thinking about shopping him this coming summer. I doubt it happens. He is getting up there in age, and he's got 2 more seasons after this year. He's got some trade protection, so I don't know. But my feeling is, he is showing those signs of age-related decline. He can't skate like he used to. He loses more of those battles than we're used to. He just hasn't looked like the DeMello of his prime era, or even his era of his first couple of seasons with the Jets. I still will always have a soft spot for him. I love Dylan DeMello. He's been one of my favorite of Chevy's acquisitions. That said, if he departs this summer, I don't think it's the worst outcome. I think the Jets are seeing what Salamonson can do. I think that they would also probably like to get some of the cap space back and maybe reallocate it a bit. They have a couple of raises that they're going to have to give out. And as much as I do love DeMello, and I think he has really made Winnipeg his home, this might be a year where they start to think about whether he really has a future with the Jets. Winnipeg probably wants to get younger, maybe a bit faster on the back end. We'll see. They might like Jacob Bryson more. I would caution against going that route for a lot of reasons, but we know how the Jets are. Defense is not always the thing that they have the clearest read on, but we'll see. They do have some college kids, though, as well, that will likely need a pro role pretty soon. And while DeMello is not necessarily blocking them anytime soon, I do wonder, again, if the Jets start to think about maybe cutting ties this summer and moving him on to another squad if he's open to it. Elsewhere, Perfetti will come back with some sort of a deal. I expect a bit of a bridge. I don't think we'll see a long-term deal just yet. Taves, I think, will come back. I suspect JT is going to be brought in to educate and sort of work with some of the kids. That means I think Lambert and Roseanne are here to stay, unless Brad wants to leave, which he did request a trade a while back, or at least was rumored to. I do think he's got a pretty firm spot with this Jets team, and perhaps in the top 6 role. I don't want to guarantee that, and I think that's saying a little bit more than we're seeing right now with him. But I just have a sense that the more that Lambert continues to run with these minutes and really soar above some of the expectations that were laid before him, I do think that the Jets might think longer about whether he should be playing with guys like Perfetti or even Scheifele. Winnipeg has been missing the Nick Ehlers love for a long time. It was clear this season that Nick's presence was just absent and really left a bit of a hole for this team in a lot of areas. Lambert will not be that kind of player, but he does have a couple of similar traits and some tool sets that might align somewhat. In terms of Parker Ford, he's probably still with the Moose. I don't know that I would anticipate him really spending too much time with the Jets. Cole Koepke, I'd expect to be let go. I think Koepke's been fine. It also wouldn't shock me if they did give him like a 1-year deal, but I don't think that's entirely like a priority. If it does happen, it'd probably be, a little later in the offseason. Jacob Bryson probably not going to come back is my guess, but the Jets do like these sort of depth defensemen, and if they let Miller go because he's not really healthy, and they need some backfilling, Bryson may come back on a deal. Now, Nemesnikov and Niederreiter, I have some thoughts that they might not be here next year. Both of these guys are getting up there in years. I don't know that, Nemesnikov or Niederreiter really figures into Winnipeg's long-term future plans. They've been good value while they were here. They've been really steadfast players, but you see them slowing down. You see the Jets not getting some of those earlier returns that they saw when they first got traded for. I do think as they're nearing the final years of their contracts, they might be some of the first guys out the door to some new teams to open up spots for some of the youth. I think Chibrikov will get a chance to maybe earn a spot in camp. He didn't really have the most successful run this year, but he was kind of bouncing around a bit. We'll have to see if he maybe gets a shot. I'd also think Jaeger will fight for a role in camp. He won't get it. I expect him to start the year with the Moose, but if he really does have a super strong run, maybe, just maybe, he gets an outside chance. I think, though, if there's any other player that comes from the Moose, it'll be like Danny Zhilkin. Zhilkin, they really seem to want him to start playing fourth-line minutes. I'd expect him to be one of those guys that joins Lambert and Roseanne as more full-time NHLers. In goal, I think Eric Comrie maybe comes back. I don't know what Eric's plans are. He's been, back and forth out of the Jets system for years. Milic or DiVincentis might be able to take the backup job. The Jets have a couple of goalies in the system, not a ton of depth, but some dudes who can eat minutes. So if the Jets think that Comrie might want to raise, they may let him go and choose to use one of the Moose goalies instead. It's not like any of them are going to be playing too many games, but next year's team, I'm a little more bullish on. I think there's more skill. I do have concerns that it's not going to be enough to supplant some of the bigger losses and what they still need, which is like a second line center that they can really rely upon, plus like a top end winger. But if, maybe some of these kids can step up and at least be good placeholders and maybe even grow their own games, not the worst outcome at the end of it all. But curious to know your thoughts. Which players are you really excited about? Who do you want to see on this team next year? And which ones would you perhaps be prepared to bid adieu to? Let me know in the comments below on YouTube or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. I've been putting off a little bit of a prospect update just because there's been a lot back and forth that's changed over the past couple of days. We will do that tomorrow and catch up. But for tonight's show, that's all the time that we have. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.